Hi everyone, it's the Men in Black here. Now, I watched Men in Black 3 on Wednesday, and I would have gotten a vlog up to you about Thursday night, Friday. Unfortunately, I made the mistake of not making sure my camcorder charging cable was plugged in before I plugged it into my camera. So, just at the end of my vlog, just at the time I was too late for me to do anything with it, camera turned off, lost all my footage. Couldn't redo it until today. So, you're getting this a few days later. I want to cover a few things before I go into what I thought of the actual movie. First is, I know my show's been quiet for a few weeks. I'm not unaware of this. 6 months of Green Lantern is coming. Now, I'm probably going to scale it back even further than what I was originally going to scale it back to, because it was just a much bigger undertaking than I thought, and I was just not prepared for what I had intended to do with it. So there was poor preparation on my part, and as a result it's delayed the episode several months, and I'm going to try to get everything out to you as soon as I possibly can. I also have a riff tracks coming up with Sith Jammies. Oh, and the company I work for is just closed down, so I've got a week to focus on my show and bring everything up to date. Might as well tell you guys now, all my current running shows are over. New show is on its way. It should be better, tighter, altogether a superior product. Hopefully. Other thing I'd like to talk to you about, anybody who follows my text reviews or my videos is aware of my love for the New Slash trilogy by Merrick Grant. Blackout, the third book, was just released recently. It is just as good as the others, which means that it is awesome. Go out and buy it now, as soon as you can. If you like science fiction, post-apocalyptic settings, thrillers, horror, zombies, good characters, or the internet, I said or, not and, any of the above, go out and buy this trilogy. Everything about it is awesome. And now let's get on to the movie, Men in Black 3. To talk about Men in Black 3, I've got to talk about the other two movies a little bit. Men in Black 1, of course, was awesome. Dark sci-fi, bit of action. Not quite enough to be considered horror, but it is veering toward that a little bit. Same with action. You know, good twist on the Men in Black stories everyone's talked about. That is also what X-Files was inspired by. It's an adaptation of comics, but it is not faithful. It's effectively a completely different universe than the comics it was originally going to be an adaptation of. It was going to star Robin. Starred Will Smith instead. Robin from Batman Forever? Whatever. It's got Will Smith, and glad they made that decision. I'm a sucker for a Will Smith movie. Men in Black 2. I liked this movie, but it is one of the few movies I would consider to be a straight-up guilty pleasure. Difference between where Jason Goes to Hell is a movie that I think did its job properly, was well made, and I enjoyed. Men in Black 2 made a lot of very poor decisions, and I still found it a fun time. That's the difference. Men in Black 3 is a bit more closer to the tone of the original, but it overcorrects Part 2's mistakes, as if it's afraid to be associated with Part 2. Which means that it is in between their two qualities. It's not as good as the first, for several reasons, but it is also better than the second. Jeeves was overused in the second, did not appear in the third. Frank was overused in the second, did not appear in the third. Urban comedy was overused in the second, very basic appearance in the third, just enough to, be Will Smith. Just barely enough. Lighting, closer to the first and the second. MIBHQ, closer to the first and the second. They still did the, these people are aliens on the wall. Still some pretty obvious things like Lady Gaga and whatever, but not as in your face as the Michael Jackson scene in Part 2. Any other comparisons I'd like to make? guess I should talk about the enemy. Now, well, okay, actually a few other things. Now, if you noticed, in part 2, they set up a thing with sexy women. This wasn't really present in part 1. They were a little more mature than that. Part 2, they were like, you know what? We're having a Victoria's Secret model be the main villain. Part 3 almost starts off that way. We see a woman in basically latex bondage gear bringing a cake into a prison. There's noise going on behind me. Hopefully you can't hear it. But this is pretty quickly discarded. This is eye candy for the first few minutes and nothing more. This is not a relevant feature. There are females in the plot, but they are relative ones, not eye candy. Although it is kind of interesting how Agent O is the same age now that she was 40 years ago. So that's a flaw. Speaking of which, Tommy Lee Jones definitely looks older. I don't know if that's makeup or if he's just aged more between Men in Blacks 2 and 3 than he did between the movies I've seen from him in the 90s and Men in Black 2. I did not watch Captain America in order to get a good comparison. Now, Agent K 40 years ago was played by an actor who's already 60 years old, but comparing his face on IMDb to in the movie, I would say makeup did a fairly good job. He does not look 60. For some reason, I actually thought he was played by Karl Urban, but he was not. His name is Josh Brolin, I believe is his name. He was in True Grit, a few other things. Other people who aren't from me will recognize him, I think. He does a very good Tommy Lee Jones impression. You believe this character is K. I mean, he does not look exactly like Tommy Lee Jones, but when he speaks, it's very clear that this is the same guy. Alright, I'm trying to come up with what else I can say before I actually start getting into the spoilers. I'm trying to hold spoilers off until the tail end of the review. I'm kind of going to say this. One of the reasons why it's not as good as the first is they play it very safe. Now in the first, things change. D retires. K retires. We bring in J. We bring in L. New team. J goes through a change. The world is in danger and everything. Well, the world's in danger in every MIB movie. That's kind of the rule. But in this movie, there's not as much of a change. Things are a little happier now than they were before. And for no very clear reason. And again, I'll explain that at the end of this video. I don't want to spoil plot details until I get to the point where people can turn the video off. So, altogether, I'm going to say, recommend this movie. Watch it if you enjoyed the first. It goes out of its way to pretend the second did not exist, even going so far as to say that J and K have been partners for 14 years, when obviously there was a 6-year gap where K was a neutral. So they try to ignore that fact and treat them as though they've been partners since the end of the first movie. They really do not want to acknowledge that the second exists because it is so widely disregarded. Which is again why Jeeves doesn't appear, Frank doesn't appear. There is a picture of Frank. Were there any other Easter eggs? I pretty much brought up everything of note in the Easter eggs. There wasn't too much, at least not much that I saw, which is kind of disappointing because I was kind of hoping for something like how Star Wars used its premise to be able to bring E.T. into the Galactic Senate. You know, it was a very subtle thing, not overt, but at the same time it happened, and it made use of the fact that despite being in different different companies owning the rights, different creators, that they were still able to coexist in the same universe. And I was kind of hoping when we walked into MIB HQ to find like a Dalek or something, nothing overt enough to get BBC to sue, was it Universal, I think. I should have looked that up. I'm thinking it's Universal. But, nothing very overt like that, but just enough to acknowledge that, that this is another sci-fi property that they're paying homage to. You know, doesn't help that, you know, well, I discovered Doctor Who in the past several months, so it is kind of on my mind. But there's also the fact that, you know, you have organizations like Torchwood, which is effectively the British equivalent to the Men in Black, and now I'm kind of hoping to see some sort of crossover between them. But, you know, some sort of acknowledgement to other franchises out there. It's not something no one's ever heard of. What else would I like to talk about? The main villain. Unfortunately, I did not look up his name before doing this vlog again. I have not heard of him from anything else. But he's very much overacting in this. And there's times where it works, especially in the beginning. Then there's times where he's having a conversation with himself. And it's basically, I'm acting harder. For about 5 minutes or so. And it's it's very laughable. And it really takes away any chance you have of taking this villain seriously when he's roaring at himself. And that's where a lot of, no, I won't say a lot. I haven't seen a ton of views on this video, but on this movie. But that's where some people say that you can't see him winning, and I can see that. He's one of those characters. This is a very lazy fiction technique, but it happens more often than you might think. That you have a character who's both very smart and very dumb at the same time. And what I mean is, he's smart enough to break himself out of prison without an army of people with guns or anything like that. He's smart enough to get himself out of prison basically by his own power, with one person helping him. Very minor role on her part. He's smart enough to find a time travel device, to go back in time. This is very beginning of the movie if you haven't seen the trailer, so I'm not really spoiling anything there. He's smart enough to do all this, but he's not smart enough to make a plan that will work. His basic plan is that he's going to personally kill someone while his past self does everything the same way that he did it the first time and had gotten arrested for. No change to the plan other than standing there and sniping. So, coupled with the other, a few other things, it's basically one of those characters who's, very dumb when he's on screen and very smart when the plot calls for him to be smart. Even the self from the past, when he realizes that he has come back from the future to prevent himself from being arrested, does not change up his plan at all. He does nothing differently, even aware that if he does not change his plans, Kay is going to arrest him. But he assumes that his future self, standing by like a sniper, is going to save everything. I'm just about at the end of things I can talk about without major spoilers. So I'm going to basically say, if I haven't said this already, if you enjoyed the first film, watch this. It's not as good, but I'd probably say 6 or 7 out of 10. Maybe leaning towards 7. Probably, yeah, I'd say probably leaning towards 7. It's a fun movie, same universe, same characters. That's about it for my recommendation there. If you've never seen the first movie, watch it first. Don't see this without having seen the first movie. The second is optional. First is not. Now, to talk about some of my nitpicks more in detail. What we're supposed to know is that when Kay and Boris face off, that something major happens that changes Kay for the rest of his life. He becomes a colder individual, forms less attachments, becomes less articulate when it comes to these emotions, and we don't see it. I mean, like I said, Boris does nothing differently. Jay's role in the past is basically to prevent future Boris from killing Kay. Literally, the only thing Kay does differently is that instead of arresting Boris, he shoots them. So the moral of this story is, if you kill the people who cause problems for you, you will be a happier person. And I don't know if that's the moral they're trying to get across, but that is the message of this movie. If you kill the bad guy, you will be happier later in life. And that's a really weird message. I don't think that's the message they were aiming for. And that's about it on my thoughts on Men in Black 3. Go watch it. It's not a must-see unless you're a huge fan. You can wait to rent it. Definitely watch the first movie before this. Second is optional. And if you cannot stand time travel, this won't. Hey guys, I'm back again. I need to edit this in, but I did leave out something about the ending to Men in Black 3 that I forgot to bring up. This is another major spoiler, but it's foreshadowed during the film that Will Smith basically had a deadbeat dad. His dad left him as a child. Now, we meet this character later on, basically the only black man in the 60s, I think. 70s, wow. Moving on in years now. But, you know, the only black man in the entire 70s, it seems. And I knew in advance that Will Smith's father appeared in this movie, so I knew who he was. And that something bad was obviously going to happen to him based on the foreshadowing, and because I knew who he was. And this is probably the event that's supposed to have changed Kay as a person, which is before Boris gets killed / arrested, depending on the timeline. He kills Will's father. By Will, I mean obviously James Edwards, yeah. Agent J. So, Jay, by the way, is still watching as this happens. Kay does not realize it. But the Colonel is killed. You know, we don't know his name in the movie because of this twist. I was calling him Colonel Smith in my mind the whole time he was appearing. After he dies, his son comes out, reveals that it's Jay. You know, he tells Kay his name and everything. And I think it was very well done. Now, I think part of it was the fact that I was kind of building up. As soon as this character appeared on screen, the only black man in the movie, I knew he was going to die. Kind of cliche, but I also knew his role in the movie beforehand. So maybe they could have foreshadowed it more, but the spoiling that I had been subjected to did that for it. So, I mean, I don't cry at movies. I don't really cry at books. I don't cry at events. You know, I'm generally not that kind of person. But I did tear up a little bit in this, which puts this scene up there with Mara Jade Skywalker's death in 2006 for me. So, very high marks there. Again, I don't know if it would have been as effective a scene had I not been built up to it by being spoiled. You'd have to ask, you know, somebody else who was not spoiled before watching the movie. But it was a very well done scene, I think, and definitely one of the reasons that this movie is high up there. And it's possible, I take snipes at this ending, but it's possible that Kay, having spoken to Jay, you know, nothing specific about this, but Kay's having spoken to Jay, met him, might have changed the way he reacted to the child, because he was very friendly, very heartfelt when he spoke to young James. And that might have been the cause of him not becoming colder later, but it's really not explained or really hinted at that much. So yeah, heartfelt scene, doesn't change much about what I said about the rest. And that's that. Man in Black out.